Donald Trump's decision to pull out from Syria was unexpected, especially to the Kurdish militias allied with the U.S. But in yet another surprise, Kurdish groups have asked their former enemy, President Assad, for help defending against Turkey. For more on this story, we're turning now to investigative journalist Max Blumenthal. Max, good of you to be here with me.
Great to be on.
So talks with Damascus and Moscow are likely focus of talks among the Kurdish senior leadership. Not wanting a repeat of what happened in Afrin earlier this year, the Kurds are now asking the government to step in. What does this say about how dire the situation is there?
Well, what happened in Afrin was absolutely horrible, and it actually showed that the U.S. was already willing to abandon their Kurdish allies of convenience in Syria when the Turks and their mercenary forces of Salafi militiamen who formerly opposed the government of Assad overran the city, looted it, and we saw actual video of the Turkish mercenaries singing jihadist anthems, and it was an absolutely horrifying moment. Not only for Kurds, but for Syrians. And so they're determined to not make a repeat of this. We've heard conflicting reports of actually the Syrian government entering the city of Manbij, which was recaptured from ISIS in 2016 by the Kurdish SDF. And this would indicate that there is on-the-ground collaboration between the Kurdish SDF and the Syrian government. A lot of people are troubled by this in Turkey. The U.S. didn't consider this a possibility, but the fact is that these Kurds are Syrians. They're Syrian citizens, and actually this is a natural partnership against a common enemy in ISIS. And so both the Syrian government and the SDF are determined not to see ISIS return, and I think it's actually a positive development as far as stabilization goes.
Okay, so there's some common enemy happening there within them attacking ISIS together. And I'm glad that you brought up that they're Syrian citizens, because Syrian locals have their thoughts on all this stuff that's happening too. Listen to what some of them had to say, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
People shall flee and terrorism will prevail. The American withdrawal will destabilize the security we have had for a couple of years in this region.
The American withdrawal from Manbij by Donald Trump was disappointing for all in the city. As I said, all Manbij residents are afraid that others might come to loot, just as it happened during the ISIL era. We want a safe situation.
What do you make of what the locals there had to say?
Well, local Kurds are understandably anxious, but we have to actually remember that according to a United Nations report, ISIS was festering and was enjoying a resurgence under the U.S. presence right around the areas that the U.S. had captured around Raqqa. So it wasn't as if ISIS wasn't coming back. I actually think there's strong evidence that the U.S. was actually maintaining residual pockets of ISIS because its real mission in Syria was not necessarily an anti-ISIS mission. It was an anti-Iran mission, and we've seen that in the testimony of Trump's Syria handler, James Jeffrey, who's obsessed with pushing using Syria as a leverage point against Tehran. So actually, Iran attacked ISIS positions, nearly killing the ISIS emir, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in October. And those positions happened to be 3 kilometers down the road from the U.S. What was the leader of ISIS doing 3 kilometers from the U.S.? So it doesn't appear clear to me that the U.S. leaving is actually going to be a boon to ISIS, especially if the Syrian government, backed by Russia, is able to move in and work with the Kurds on the ground. Now,
I want to get back to the subject of Iran in just a minute, so hold that thought. But in terms of the American withdrawal from Syria, how do you look at that? Is that a tacit green light, though, for Turkey to kind of do as they wish, especially do as they wish to the Kurds? Or maybe is this some sort of kowtowing to Russia, or could it be something else?
Well, in April, Donald Trump and his administration put forward a proposal for an all-Arab force to actually replace U.S. forces. Trump wanted the U.S. troops out of Syria earlier this year, and it would be funded by Saudi Arabia. But with the Khashoggi drama, Jamal Khashoggi being sawed to pieces in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, Trump's plan went to pieces as well because Mohammed bin Salman became persona non grata in Washington. So Erdogan steps in. He becomes the inevitable person to step in here, which is very troubling to the Kurds, not only because of the enmity, the historical enmity of Kurdish oppression at the hands of Turkey, but because, as Patrick Coburn reported at The Independent earlier this year, a lot of those Turkish mercenaries are former Islamic State fighters. And these are people who wish to slaughter and commit genocide against the Kurds. That's one of the reasons we do have to be worried about a Turkish onslaught.
And then how does Iran come into play with, as all these moving parts, how do they work?
If Syria and the Kurdish SDF, which is really the YPG, are unable to retake territory and stabilize it, which would be the best scenario from an anti-ISIS perspective, and Turkey moves in with that mercenary force that I mentioned, Iran and the Shia militias affiliated with Iran will ramp up their presence. Their mortal enemy is ISIS. It's a national strategic threat. And if Iran ramps up its presence, that will lead Israel to escalate, along with its cutouts in Washington, and that could be a very destabilizing scenario. So again, the best scenario from an anti-ISIS and stability perspective is a Syrian alliance with the Kurdish SDF.
All right, investigative journalist Max Blumenthal, thank you for sharing your expertise on the subject.
Thanks for having me.